The material from this lecture comes from chapters 3 and 4 in your reading. Note that I am not covering everything in this chapter, so make sure that you take the time to read both chapters thoroughly because the questions on the quiz come directly from chapters 3 and 4, so you want to make sure that you read the chapters thoroughly. So we're going to look at Greek philosophy. Many historians of philosophy argue that Western philosophy began in a city called Miletus around the 6th century BC, although it certainly may be the case that philosophical thinking and writing happened earlier than this. The reason why we say the 6th century BC is because as far as recorded history is concerned, this is all that we know about. So now these first philosophers are called Milesian philosophers because they came from Miletus. As far as we can tell from their writings, or at least from early writings about them, we know that what they were interested in is the big questions of life and the big questions of existence. Questions like, how or why do things come into being? What is the basic substance of reality? And does everything reduce to one substance? Or does everything reduce to many substances? Now, the early philosophers were not the first to ask questions like these, but what's unique about them is that they were the first to answer these questions without an appeal to religion or mythology. The Hebrews certainly had their creation story in Genesis to explain how things came into being, as did the Egyptians, the Chinese, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, and others. But these philosophers attempted to answer these questions as purely philosophical questions, or we might even say today as purely scientific questions, and this is what's unique about the philosophers. Now, the first of the philosophers, the first of the Milesian philosophers at least to talk about, is the philosopher Thales. Thales was a type of engineer by training, and he did ask the big questions. Questions like, what is the nature of reality? Or what is the ultimate explanation for all that is? He wanted to find ultimate explanations. And what I find fascinating is that these are still the big questions that we ask today, some 2,600 years later. And I'm thinking specifically of the work done by theoretical physicists who want to discover what's known as a theory of everything. Theories related to either string theory or loop quantum gravity or general relativity or particle physics. And we certainly know that the pursuits that they're pursuing today are far more complicated. But what I find interesting is that the fundamental questions are still the same. And when it comes to Thales, the way that he answered these biggest questions, the question about the nature of reality, is to suggest that all is water. So if you want to know what the basic substance is that holds everything together in existence, for Thales, it's water. And we can certainly understand why such a suggestion might seem reasonable. I mean, maybe it's strange for us today, but if you think about it, in places where there is no water, like the desert for example, things tend to die. The human body is composed mostly of water. Water comes down from the sky, and if you dig long enough in the earth, you will find water. And if you look over the ocean, what goes on forever, at least seemingly forever? Water. So Thales' answer is that the most fundamental substance of reality is water. Shortly after Thales comes the philosopher Anaximander, who argued that all is, as he calls it, a peiron, which some have translated as an indeterminate boundlessness, or I think your text says as an infinite boundlessness. So for Anaximander, all that is real is an indeterminate boundlessness, the apeiron. Now there are many ways to explore what Anaximander might have been trying to get at here, but I think it's helpful to contrast him with Thales, and when you compare the two, you see some distinctions that are actually quite important. So Thales argues that all is water. Well, if we could speak more generally about this, we might say that everything reduces to some form of material substance. Now, specifically for Thales, he thought that material substance is water, but we could speak more generally and just say it's some material substance, whatever it may be. And this is actually a philosophical doctrine that's around today, which is known as materialism, which is the belief that the natural material world that we see is, to use the word of Carl Sagan, all that is, all that was, and all that ever will be. But now Anaximander argued that a material substance cannot be the basis for all of reality because material substances are finite. And if we want to get to the fundamental aspect of reality, we need something that's not finite, but something that's infinite. And so, to get an understanding of what he's talking about here, and he might mean another thing. So, a lot of the stuff you have to understand that we're sort of just taking stabs in the dark, trying to figure out what these early philosophers mean. But let's pretend for a moment that the image on your screen represents the entirety of the universe. Now, Anaximander wouldn't have been thinking in these categories, but I think it provides a good illustration to maybe get at what he means by an indeterminate boundlessness. Now, in this universe, we have an earth, we have various substances like fire, water, wind, or we might say air, and several other elements. The fire, wind, air, water were certainly ones that were important for the Greek philosophers. But now when we look at these substances, all of these substances are finite, and it's possible for any of these substances not to exist. We can certainly imagine what it would be like for fire to not exist, so we can get rid of fire. The same is true for water. We can get rid of the water. We can get rid of air and wind. And we can get rid of the earth itself. These are all finite substances, which means we can delete them out of existence because they don't need to exist. They're all what you might call contingent objects. But now if you start deleting things, you get to the point where you're looking at the whole universe or the galaxy, and you ask, is it possible for the universe itself not to exist? Well, it seems like it's possible for it not to exist. You can delete it off the computer screen that you're looking at. And so when you start deleting everything, when you start deleting all of these material substances, you have to ask the question, what's left? Well, Anaximander describes what's left as the apeiron, which is, we might say, an infinite, impersonal, non-material, non-spatial, ultimate reality. It's the white screen that you're looking at. It's very abstract to think in these terms, but it's simply the negation of the material world that we see. That's what's infinite. That's what's eternal. Now, at this point, a very important distinction emerges that later philosophers will call the distinction between what's known as necessary objects or facts and beings. We'll talk about this later on in the semester. But there's necessary objects versus contingent objects, facts, or beings. Now, a necessary being, such as the apeiron, exists by necessity, which means the non-existence of the apeiron is logically impossible. So as you're looking at the white screen right now, you can imagine what it was like to delete the earth. You can imagine what it was like to delete fire, to delete water. You can even imagine what it was like to delete the whole universe. But you come to some point where you can't even imagine what it would be like to delete everything else. Like, what would it be like to delete this white space that's on your screen? You can't do it. And so this is what's called a logically necessary being. Now, on the other hand, contingent beings are beings that exist on the basis of something else. And so it is possible for this world to not exist. It was possible to delete the earth. It's possible for life not to exist. It's possible for you not to exist, for me not to exist. Because we are all contingent beings, which means that we owe our existence to some other more fundamental reality. So, this distinction between necessary beings and contingent beings is an important distinction to make, and it's one that will come up later on in the semester. And we can find hints of this concept in Anaximander. So, Thales argued that all is water. Anaximander argued that all is apeiron. And then after Anaximander came his disciple, Anaximenes, who is the last philosopher to consider from this school of thought. And he argued that the most basic substance of reality is air. Now, as we continue, we don't have time to go into depth on many of these other philosophers, so I do want to just again say make sure that you read this chapter thoroughly, because what I'm going to do here is just going to be a very brief overview. So you'll want to read the chapter, get the details, so that you can prepare yourself for the quiz. But we'll dig into a few of these philosophers here, just real generally. So the next one is Pythagoras. Pythagoras rejected materialism and argued that numbers are really what's ultimately real. And if you think about this solution can make sense because numbers are rational things, rational entities, and that might be a good explanation for why the world seems to be so orderly and rational, because at the base of it, the world operates on numbers. So that was Pythagoras' thought. Parmenides argued that all is in flux, or that all is changing. Zeno introduces this notion called the paradox of motion, where he argued that motion is ultimately an illusion. So it'll be important to read the sections on Zeno and understand this paradox. But one of the easiest ways to understand it is to think about the race between the tortoise and the hare. So if you have this race between the tortoise and the hare, if the tortoise gets a head start in the race, let's say the tortoise is in the lead, and the tortoise is running at 1 mile an hour. And then let's suppose that the hare is running at 10 miles per hour. Now, common sense would tell us that eventually the hare is going to surpass the tortoise because the hare is running faster than the tortoise. But Zeno says that this is not actually true if you think about it rationally. Because if you think about it, there ought to be an infinite amount of points between the tortoise and the hare, which means that the hare has an infinite distance to run before he can pass the tortoise, which means no matter how fast the hare is going, he'll never be able to overcome an infinite distance, since there are an infinite number of points between the tortoise and the hare, and therefore the hare will never overcome the tortoise. Now, the point of this whole illustration, paradox, is to show that motion is actually an illusion and that it doesn't actually happen. And so that's Zeno's paradox. Make sure you read that section and understand what he's talking about there. He also has the illustration of the arrow, but that will certainly be a question that will come up on your quiz. The next philosopher is Heraclitus, who argued that all is a fiery logos. So think of fire being the basic substance for reality, and then logos, reason. There's some sort of rational component to reality. So that's Heraclitus. Empedocles is next, and he argues that all is water, earth, air, and fire. Go back and... Okay, yes. He argued that all is water, earth, air, and fire. Now, what's important here is he's suggesting that maybe we shouldn't try to reduce all of reality to one substance. Maybe it's the case that all of reality is broken up into different substances. So why reduce our conceptions to just water, or why reduce it to just earth? Why not have a diversity or a plurality of substances? And then this was an important thought that came up early in the history of philosophy. The atomists agreed with this, but they even took this further and argued that maybe all is indestructible atoms and an infinite number of atoms. So all is many, not all is one. Anaxagoras argued that all is mind, and the mind is what controls the infinite amount of parts in reality, so that the infinite amount of parts that we experience are orderly and rational. So next, we look at the sophists. So at this point in the history, Greek philosophers, as we saw, have been differing on the big questions of life. They did not agree on whether reality could be reduced to one substance or whether reality consisted of many substances. They also could not agree whether the foundation of reality was ultimately material or whether it was immaterial. And what made it worse is that when these philosophers were proposing their ideas, they usually presented compelling arguments for their ideas, and they even presented compelling arguments against the case of their opponents. And so when the sophists come along, they recognized this and said, maybe the pursuit of truth regarding the big questions of life is actually a fruitless pursuit. And maybe it's the case that we cannot know what's ultimately real because we don't seem to have access to it. So we should stop wasting our time on truth and start focusing on more practical things such as rhetoric and persuasion. And so the sophists came along and said, maybe there are no answers to these big questions, and maybe we just need to accept that fact. They were skeptical of any religious, ideological, or metaphysical claims, and they were ethical relativists, which meant that the sophists believed that there were no ethical truths to be discovered. Rather, ethical truths were invented by men, by humans. That was the position of the sophists. Now, a well-known sophist is Gorgias, who argued that nothing exists. So as we look at these ultimate questions, what's ultimately real? Is it water? Is it air? Is it a boundlessness? What is it? Gorgias said it's none of these. Like we don't know. There's nothing that actually exists. There's nothing to be discovered. But even if something did exist, it couldn't be known. And even if it could be known, it certainly couldn't be communicated. And so the reason that he argued this is he said, just look at the history of philosophy. It's been a few hundred years now. People haven't come up with the answers. And if they did come up with the answers, they certainly haven't been able to communicate it persuasively. And so if all of this is a case, what follows is we should live by appearances. We should practice prudence. We should be practical and avoid idle speculations about questions like what is ultimately real, because those types of questions don't get us anywhere. And so when it came to education, he still believed in education, but he believed that we should pursue practical education. Education related to farming that actually produces something, or education like law, which actually does something in society rather than just arguing about the existence of reality. We should pursue some sort of practical education. The next sophist was Protagoras, who his famous statement is, man is the measure of all things, both of things that are, man is the measure that they are, and of the things that are not, man is the measure that they are not. So for Protagoras, truth is not something that we discover, truth is something that we invent. And so we can understand the basic principles of the sophists as follows. Moral rules are fashioned deliberately by each community, which means that they have relevance and authority only for the people in that community. So any moral rules can be different from culture to culture, and there is no standard up there somewhere that that exists for all people in all times and all places. There are things that each community invent for themselves. Moral rules are furthermore unnatural, and people obey them only because of the pressure of public opinion. They further would argue that the essence of justice is power, or might makes right. So, justice, ethics, moral truths, all of these truths are simply the powerful determining what's right for the weak. And so that's how you determine what justice is. That's how you determine what morality is. And then the good life is a life of pleasure for the sophists, not truth. After the sophists comes Socrates. Now, Socrates couldn't stand the sophists. However, he did like to ask the hard questions. So the sophists like to ask hard questions, and Socrates also liked to ask the hard questions. And what made Socrates different than the sophists is that his questions were motivated by a love for truth, whereas the sophists, when they asked the hard questions, they were actually attempting to flee from truth and demonstrate that there was no truth. Socrates, on the other hand, believed that there was a truth, and on that basis, he asked the hard questions so that he could discover what is truth. Socrates' famous statement is, "The unexamined ideas are not worth living any more than the unexamined life is worth living." So the sophists said, there is no such thing as truth. Socrates' common response to this was, well, is that true? Because if you look at the proposition, there is no such thing as truth, that itself is a proposition that is making a truth claim. And so either that proposition is true or either that proposition is false. Now, if you say the proposition is true, then the proposition itself says there is no such thing as truth, which means it could not be true. And so what Socrates points out here is that statements like this are self-referentially incoherent, and if that's the case, they ought not to be believed. And so Socrates was very pointed in his response to the sophists. He didn't like the sophists because he thought they were lazy in their thinking. Socrates was born in 470 BC in Athens. He was more concerned with ethics than he was with metaphysics. So the earlier Greek philosophers asked questions about what's ultimately real. Socrates was more concerned with what it means to live the good life. He was more concerned with how to live life, what is justice, rather than what is the nature of reality. He rejected relativism and embraced truth. He was accused of heresy, of not believing in the Olympian gods, and of corrupting the youth. Now, most likely what this means is that he simply was encouraging people to think. The oracle at Delphi said that Socrates was the wisest man. Now, when Socrates heard about this, he thought this can't possibly be true. Surely there are people in political leadership that are wiser than I am. And so he made it his goal to go all throughout Athens to find someone who was wiser than him. And so what he did is he quizzed those who had a reputation of being wise. And he would ask them difficult questions such as, what is justice? How do we know what justice is? And while he was doing this, he actually exposed the ignorance of many of the political leaders. And this type of questioning has now become known as the Socratic method, a method where you ask difficult, pointed questions for the purpose of getting at the truth of some particular issue. Socrates was sentenced to death because of his influence, and on his way to his sentence, he forgave his accusers, saying that I am not angry with my condemners or with my accusers, because they have done me no harm. And so this is Socrates. Now, after Socrates comes Plato. So the most famous three philosophers, or the most common Greek philosophers that you'll hear about, are Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. When it comes to Socrates, we don't have any of his actual writings. The reason we know anything about Socrates is because his later followers or disciples wrote about his teachings, such as Plato. We do have Plato's writings, we have dialogues from Plato, and Plato writes about Socrates, Aristotle writes about Socrates, and others do as well. But Plato, um, well, if you look at the picture here on your screen, this is a painting of Plato and Aristotle. So Plato is the guy in your left, and Aristotle is the guy in your right. Now, what this picture points out is if you notice Plato on your left, he has his hand with a finger pointing up to the sky. And Aristotle has his hand sort of hovering toward the ground. Now, this is symbolic because Plato argued that if you want to know anything about justice, if you want to know anything about what's morally right, what's ethical, what the good life is, or the nature of reality, the place that you go is to look above, to a realm that he calls the forms, which is a realm that's more of an ideal realm. It's a conceptual realm, but it's not the physical world that we can see, taste, touch, and feel. Aristotle, on the other hand, had a different perspective on this. And he said if you want to know what justice is, if you want to know what goodness and beauty is, where they derive from them, you don't need to look at some abstract world called the forms. Rather, you can find it in the particulars of the real world that we can see, taste, touch, and feel. And so that is a big distinction between Plato and Aristotle. I would love to spend several lectures talking about Plato and Aristotle, but we simply just don't have time here. But I think it's important to note the significance of Plato on the history of philosophy. The philosopher Alfred North Whitehead said that the history of philosophy is really a series of footnotes to Plato. Now, that might be somewhat of an overstatement, but it is true that Plato's philosophy and Aristotle's philosophy and the previous Greek philosophers do contribute to later thought. And it's incredible to find that many of the questions that we still wrestle with today can find their roots back into philosophers like Plato and in Aristotle. But Plato argued that reality consists of two parts. One part is the forms, which is a conceptual realm of perfection, the place where there are ideals. And then the second part is the particulars, which are individual events, objects, or acts that we can see in the world. So you think of a form as an ideal. Think of like a car. So you might have in your mind an ideal car with all the perfections that it might have. Maybe it's a Dodge Viper, mint condition, perfect, ideal car. And then when you go to look at any particular car, it seems that no car will ever meet that actual ideal. And so for Plato, there are two separate types of realities. One, the reality where there are ideals, where there's perfect carness, where there is perfect triangleness, perfect duckness, because in the ideal world, we can conceive of a perfect triangle. But in the particular world, we can never experience or draw a perfect triangle. There will always be some sort of imperfection in it. So the famous illustration that Plato used to demonstrate this was his allegory of the cave, which I'm sure many of you, if you've heard anything about Plato, this is probably the first thing that you've heard about him. The allegory of the cave tells this story about prisoners in a cave who have been chained to their chairs since their birth. And they've been forced to look forward at a wall, which is simply the casting of shadows. And so their whole life, all they ever experience are shadows on the wall. And so if you ask them, what is a chair? the prisoners will point to the shadow of a chair. But that shadow is certainly a distortion of what an actual chair is. Um, or if you ask them what is a table or what is a cat, they will point to the shadows on the wall. But Plato argues that those shadows aren't the reality. They're simply a shadow of the reality. And if you want to know what reality itself is, then you need to unchain yourself from the chairs and you need to go out of the cave and look at what reality actually is. Look at what the real substance is that has been casting those shadows. And so for him, there is such a thing as an ideal table, as an ideal chair, as an ideal cat. And the world that we perceive, the world of the particulars, are all imperfections of what is um, ultimately good in the realm of the forms. So that's all I have for this chapter. Again, go and read through chapters 3 and 4 to prepare yourself for the quiz.